Hello, everybody. Welcome to our webinar. Pretty big webinar today with our wonderful speaker, host, Professor Jeanne Liedtka. I met Jeanne at a Design Management Institute event in, what was it, November. She did a great presentation with a similar topic to the webinar today. I thought this is important. This needs to be spread out, and everybody needs to be using this framework. So thank you, Jeanne, for again accepting this invitation.
It's great to be here.
And with me today, I have also Jim Kalbach, our head of customer success and enterprise transformation. He'll be joining us on the Q&A. And we have Emilia Armstrong, one of his great transformation managers, and David, who's been helping us organize the event, and he'll be sharing on social media some of the visuals that we prepared for this webinar. So, Jim, can you go to the next slide, please? And say hi, Jim.
Yeah, hi everybody. Mariano, thanks for having me. It's great to be here with Jeanne. If you do have any questions, type them into the Q&A pane. There's a chat pane in your webinar software and a Q&A pane. If you want us to answer a question or you want to address a question to Jeanne, type it in the Q&A pane. We'll try to get to as many as we can during the webinar.
Yeah, and I see there's a lot of people saying hello from Berlin, hello from Dallas. That's, again, we have a global audience connecting today. Hopefully you all speak English. But something that it's cool about technology today is that we know from information in social networks mostly where you are coming from in terms of where you work, right? So we see a lot of folks from professional services, from media, from internet businesses connecting today. But what's most relevant, I think, for the conversation today is that it's folks in organizations of all sizes. As you can see, I mean, big chunk from folks in enterprises with 100,000 or more employees, but also a lot of SMBs being represented. And if I combine professional services with small employee count, it's probably a lot of agencies and consultants trying to help large firms transform. And in terms of people, it's product and engineering, and probably like others, a lot of consultants. So this is who you are out there. There's approximately 800 people live right now. Hello from Portland, hello from Palo Alto, hello everybody. So Jeanne, it's 9:03, I made my introduction, but you are clear to go.
Great. Well, thank you, Mariano, for giving me this opportunity to come and to talk to all of you about a subject that is near and dear to my heart. And I imagine it is to yours too. And that's, how do we really begin to assess the impact of design thinking in action? For those of us who work with design thinking on a day-to-day basis, I think we're very excited. We see all kinds of positive outcomes, but how do we carry that message forward with some evidence so that those who aren't as familiar with the method can become interested and take advantage of it? So I'd like to talk today about this research we've been doing actually for quite some time at the University of Virginia here at the Darden School of Business. Our journey started about 10 years ago when we got very interested in the topic of innovation and organic growth. We wanted to understand whether the practices and behaviors of managers who were successful at growing their business were similar to those of other managers who were less successful. That led us to design thinking, because our initial studies told us that the practices that natural growth leaders were doing intuitively, design thinking had methods and processes and tools that were teachable to people to learn how to get better at it. So that's been the backdrop of today. So let me talk a little bit about the research questions around this particular research. So the first question is there a there there? Lots of talk about design thinking today. Do people mean the same thing? In academia, we would call that construct validity. So our first challenge as we look across our database is, are people talking about the same thing when they talk about design thinking? Second question, and this is really why we're all here today, how does it impact performance? What's the ROI? And in order to understand that, we have to investigate the mechanisms through which design thinking is impacting innovation practices in organizations. So that's a lot of what I'll be talking about today. But an equally important question is this sustainable? More importantly, is it scalable, right? Which in part means, is it teachable? So a lot of our research has been aimed at how do we bring the benefits of design thinking to traditional managers and organizations, people who weren't trained as designers. So I'll talk a little bit about our research on that dimension and what we found about that. And then finally, for those of us committed to design thinking and leading the efforts, where do we go from here? How do we understand what the levers are that really make a difference? Our database, and this is just a sample of the different companies, consists now of almost 50 projects that we have studied in depth that use design thinking. We've studied them over a period of time, talked to the team members involved, oftentimes talked to the customers who benefited, in order to understand what are the practices and how are those practices having an impact on innovation outcomes. As you'll notice from a quick glance at this, we've got a lot of organization names that you're going to recognize, big companies. We've got tech companies. We've got federal agencies. And again, lots of good work going on using design thinking in the government space, not even just in the US, but in actually pioneering government work in areas like Denmark, New Zealand, Australia, Singapore. We've often got some cities in there and some social sector organizations like healthcare, like, for instance, Mass Agro, which is a partnership between the Mexican government and an NGO devoted to bringing sustainable modern farming practices to subsistence farmers. So our study base includes a broad variety of organizations. And what are we looking for when we look at design thinking? Well, we have our innovation wish lists. And here I'm just going to step back a little bit and talk a little bit about, in general, what we look for in innovation. The first place we look, and the reason why most of us go to design thinking processes in the first place, is we want better answers. Right? We want better products and services. We want to use design thinking to help us think more creatively about how to add value to the organization's customers that we're working with. Now, that question of adding value is really important to us because certainly in most organizations, we don't really care about novelty necessarily the way that designers do. Particularly in business, we care about value creation. And a lot of times value creation can come out of the recombination of existing things. So for instance, I always joke about, think about wheels on luggage. Wheels have existed for millennium, as have bags for someone to carry it around. But somewhere around 1970, a tinkerer who was frustrated with the amount that his family packed put them together, and now we have our roller bags. Talk about value creation. Imagine your next sprint through the airport without them. So the first thing we're going to be investigating is, to what extent does design thinking help us identify a better set of choices? The second thing we care about is, we know that innovation is a risky business. By definition, when we're trying to create something new, we're stepping into an environment of uncertainty, an environment that's less predictable. How do we then manage the inevitable risks of innovation in a way that allows us to maximize the resources we've got to work with? Next is increased implementation of ideas. We can do fantastic work generating the best ideas we can think of, but if they don't actually go forward into implementation, what was the point? So one of the things of particular interest to us is not only to understand the idea generation side, but to focus also on the idea implementation side and looking at the impact of design thinking and its ability to increase the chances that any given idea we come up with will get implemented. And then finally, a fourth item that I put on any organization's innovation wish list, which is kind of big picture, is this whole question of how do we make organizations more adaptable? Most organizations, particularly large ones, are designed for predictability and control. But we live in a world that's increasingly uncertain and unpredictable. And oftentimes we know, and I'm a strategist by training, We know that the harder we try to control, the less control we have. So one of the interesting questions for us is, if we think of the complexity and the uncertainty of modern organizations, what is the impact that design thinking can help us with, not just coming up with better products and services for tomorrow, but in the long term, building a set of durable organizational capabilities that mean we can continue to survive and prosper in the future. So how does design thinking help with that? Well, the answer, not surprisingly, it's complicated, right? In business, we like to count stuff. And certainly there's a set of outcomes for the design thinking process, kind of hard, measurable outcomes that we can count. And I'll talk a little bit about the kinds of outcomes we see in our research. But below the waterline is really where design thinking often has its most significant value, is what we're finding. So the first place it has value is it changes the way people see things, the way they feel. So perceptions. We think about things like provider scores, right? And those we can measure even if we can't exactly count. But when you go deeper still, we're observing impacts in which design thinking is changing the interactions with people, changing the innovation conversation itself. Hard to measure, but very significant. And then finally, at the deepest level, we'll talk about how we observe design thinking changing people's mindsets and the very perspective they take on the world. So let's just quickly look at some examples of that. Changes in hard measurable outcomes, well, they're all over our study, and most of these are occurring at the project level. So almost any project you look at that we've studied, we can see a set of hard, countable impacts. For instance, IBM, we looked at their redesign of trade shows, and they count the number of hot leads coming out of the redesign of the trade show. At Toyota, where we looked at them using design thinking to redesign their customer care center, we can look at reduced wait time for customers calling in as a measurable marker. Children's Health, a large health system in Dallas, Texas, committed to helping children's health improve, use design thinking to attempt to reduce inappropriate emergency room usage. And again, we can measure and see substantial reductions in inappropriate use of the ER. Finally, at Mass Agro, the organization I mentioned a little bit earlier, that's attempting to improve the use of modern and sustainable agricultural techniques by subsistence farmers, we can look at adoption rates and count the number of additional farmers and the additional acreage under new techniques as a result of this. So that's good stuff, right? But let's look deeper. Some of the most interesting things that we can also count have to do with perceptual changes. So for instance, the famous Net Promoter Score, we can look at Intuit's work using design thinking with a focus on keeping the kind of great Net Promoter Score that they already have and taking it up a notch. We can look at a variety of federal agencies where one of the big impacts we're seeing is employee engagement. We know that engagement leads to a whole host of other positive performance outcomes. So this ability to have people feel more engaged in their role in the organization is really powerful. And at Suncorp, a very large Australian financial services firm that used design thinking in order to actually do post-merger integration, bringing together two organizations with very different cultures, what they measured was the extent to which employees both understood the new strategy and personally felt committed to it, right? So other things we can measure, and in our research we see at work. What's harder to measure, but in some ways really exciting, is the changes in the conversation we see. So I'll use an example here of the US Food and Drug Administration, occupying a very highly controversial nexus of a set of stakeholders. We've looked at design work in which the FDA is pulling in government regulators from different aspects of government. They're pulling in medical device manufacturers. They're pulling in caregivers. They're pulling in the people who do maintenance. And what they're finding is when they bring them together, they see the problem in a whole new different ways, right? Often they find out regulation, for instance, isn't what the problem needs. Sources can be different. In the Good Kitchen, which is a public service kitchen in Denmark, project that began with this idea we needed to fix the menu by generating criterion not only about the elderly people receiving the meals, but also about their relationship with the people in the kitchen preparing them. A whole new set of criteria for the redesign, which allowed them to redesign much more than just the menu, came out of the changes that happened in the conversation across these diverse parties. And then finally, as an example of changes in how people think, one of the biggest obstacles in the mass agro case to the adoption of these new policies and methods was that a subsistence farmer's entire livelihood depends upon the success of the crop that year. Their fear of trying new things was absolutely legitimate. In using design thinking to create a set of experiments in which thought leaders among the farmers planted crops side by side, one with the old methods, one with the new methods, design thinking changed the way the farmers saw the situation and gave them the confidence to try new things. At Children's Health, in a situation we see repeated time and time again with design thinking where there are experts involved, whether those experts are in the medical field, physicians or nurses, whether they're engineers writing software, whether they're faculty like me in academic institutions, design thinking is changing the way people see the world by helping them to understand the perspective of the people they're trying to serve. There's a well-known cognitive bias called the egocentric empathy bias, in which most of us believe that everyone sees the world the way we do, and that the things we think people need are what they actually need. And design thinking is changing that. So if we want to go below this level, though, we go back to our question of, at a more detailed level, we've got to look at what are the mechanisms behind this bundle of things we call design thinking, right? And how are they impacting processes? Well, it turns out, back to that question of construct validity we talked about, there really is a there. Across the organizations in our study, despite a bewildering array of methods, either methods brought in by consultants like Peer Insight, the Business Innovation Factory, Being, IDEO, or brought in by academic institutions like the Stanford D School, like our own methodology here at the Darden School, like the Savannah College of Design or the Royal College of the Arts in London. Across these diverse methodologies, we see a common set of factors working at play in what we're calling design thinking. And many of these will not surprise anyone in this audience. The first is universally. The process begins with this search for deep understanding of the user's context and needs. It also includes using heterogeneous teams. So this idea of diversity and difference, bringing people with different perspectives into the conversation, fundamental to design thinking. The third is this idea of dialogue-based conversations, right, which is critical. What we know about the paradox of difference, if we go with bullet point number 2 and bring difference into a conversation, if we're not careful, it's going to deteriorate into divisive debates. And instead of better solutions, we get the least worst solution everyone will agree to. It's design thinking's dialogue-based focus that helps break people out of the debate format and lets them work together to discover a better solution than any of them walked into the organization with. And then finally, we have experimentation. Common. We know that this idea of generating a portfolio of solutions and then evaluating those solutions, treating them as hypotheses through small, cheap experiments is, whether we're talking about lean or agile or design thinking, critical to success in a predictable and unpredictable environment. The last point I'm going to talk a bit more on, because I think it was perhaps less obvious to us as researchers than the previous 4, and that is the value we saw in our research from design thinking's highly structured and facilitated processes. And I'll talk about that a bit more. But certainly one of the criticisms of design thinking has been the extent to which it is inhibiting creativity with too much structure. In our research, we find exactly the opposite. That structure does not inhibit the creativity, especially of non-designers who are learning design thinking. Instead, it frees it. So let's go into a little bit more detail then. what I'm going to do now, and again, we'll be making available to anyone who's interested the download of the full academic paper, which is, I think, about 70 pages long and goes into lots of detail that we don't have time for today. But what I'd like to do is just show you an example with one of the elements of design thinking and play that through the innovation process and the impact on outcomes. Illustrate it with one particular story, and then summarize some and leave it to you to dig into the paper and see the complete depth of it across all the factors. So let's just look at this one factor. If we look at what does the search for deep understanding of user context and needs do to impact innovation processes? Well, it has a variety of impacts. The first is it encourages people, it holds them in the problem so that they can reframe the question itself. We know that most innovation opportunities, a lot of them at least, are lost just by the definition of the problem. When people accept conventional definitions of the problem, they eliminate the most interesting possibilities before they even begin their journey. Holding people in the problem space keeps people revisiting whether they're asking the right question, and often causes a shift that allows them to ask a much more powerful question that's much more likely to create value. One of the other things that comes out and that relates to reframing is this idea of the focusing on developing user-driven criteria before you go into ideation. Again, I think one of the aspects of design thinking that we're finding incredibly powerful in our research that doesn't get a lot of attention is the value contributed by explicit design criteria. Right? Explicit design criteria, again, we think of the egocentric empathy bias. Having explicit design criteria does multiple things. First of all, it has us ideating based on user needs, not on the parochial perspectives, perhaps I, who maybe work in marketing, brought into the conversation, right? That aligns team members' perspectives. This ability to align across different perspectives is the crux of a set of benefits that we'll look at related to design thinking. The paradox of difference that we talked about earlier is that while in theory assembling these diverse teams should lead to better solutions, research suggests that often it doesn't. Teams get mired in disagreement and debate because we can't navigate those differences. We can't use them. We can't leverage them to find a higher order solution that's better than what any of us came into the room with. Design's early focus on user needs and context puts people into alignment so that by the time we get to ideas, the divisive debates aren't there. Finally, and another thing we see as critical, is this question of the way in which design thinking and involvement in that process builds emotional commitment to change. We've known for a long time that the idea of R&D does something new or marketing does, then you toss it over the wall to implementation. We know that doesn't work. One of the reasons why design thinking does work is because this deep understanding and immersion in the needs of the people we're trying to serve makes us want to serve them. Psychologists tell us that desire is a much more powerful driver of change than having goals and objectives. And design thinking with its human-centered element taps into that. So let me give you an example. The example I'd like to share is from Monash University Medical Center in Melbourne, Australia, which led by one extraordinary physician and his staff, is really revolutionizing the practices of the medical center using design thinking on everything from projects about how do we reduce long patient stays to how do we get staff to wash their hands more frequently. I'd like to focus as an example here on some work they've done around emergency mental health. So one of the contexts in which they used design thinking was people showing up in the emergency room driven by a mental health problem. They may be presenting with a drug overdose, they may be presenting with a suicide attempt, but what the clinicians at Monash saw was that things were getting worse instead of better. The intervals between visits to the emergency room were getting shorter and shorter and shorter, which was an indication to them that their interventions were not working. Repeated committees were formed to try and address this, but none were able to get to alignment across solutions because the diversity of the players involved all were committed to improving the experience of patients, but all came at it from a different perspective and had different kinds of solutions. The breakthrough came when a group of people committed to try and focus on what they called the demand side of the equation instead of the supply side, and began to use design thinking techniques to map the journey of the patients they were working with. So let me share an example with you. This was the journey of Tom. You can't read it because it's so complicated, which is kind of the point. What the clinicians discovered as they mapped different patient journeys, and in particular were captivated by Tom's, was that Tom had had 70 different interactions with caregivers, right? 3 different contacts with clinician, 18 handoffs. His information was living in 5 different IT systems, and there were 15 different paper records. When the group looked at Tom's experience, what they realized was that what was missing was not attention. It was focused care. So let's look a little bit about how these impacts of understanding Tom's needs played out in this case. At Monash, when the clinicians looked at the journey from Tom's perspective, they started to think in very different ways about how to solve the problem than they had when they were looking at it from the supply side and their delivery. What they realized when they developed these user-driven criteria before they looked for solutions was that what really mattered across the board, the top criteria was that Tom needed care and attention from one person who really cared about him. This kind of focus on care and their emergent Tom's experiences led the team to align. They saw and for the first time agreed on the outcomes they had to create, and they were emotionally committed. Here's a quote from one of the clinical staff working with Tom. "We can think all kinds of things about how we believe the system's working, but then seeing the reality of Tom's journey map, it was shocking to see how far from our intentions we'd come. Patients needed someone to be present for them because despite a flurry of activity, nothing was changing for them. And we needed to feel their blockages and studies." As we look then, we could trace for each of the 5 elements we've talked about, the way in which particular elements of design thinking impact these innovation processes, leading to better products and services, in this case, the redesign of the clinic, reduced investment risk by finding a solution that actually worked in a relatively quick way and then experimenting with it, increase the implementation likelihood of the solution because everyone now really cared about making Tom's life better, and increase the organization's adaptability, led them on an ongoing basis to look at their business differently and to change as patient needs led them. I want to spend just 1 minute that we've got on point number 5, though, and that's the creation of a structured and facilitated process. Again, I'll let you refer to the paper for the other 3 elements in between. As we looked at the creation of a structured and facilitating process, here's a quote from Dr. Campbell at Monash talking about why design thinking made a difference. "Some people have this view of design thinking that if you just get a whole bunch of people in a room with Post-it notes, something magical happens. And afterwards, you don't quite know how you did it. Instead, you have to make it clear that there's a rigorous methodology in place that people can learn. We want to be leading edge, not bleeding edge. You need a very structured methodology that lets you work safely through all of the elements." Time and time again in our research, we heard about the way in which presenting non-designers particularly with a structured approach to the problem created psychological safety that allowed them to try out new behaviors in ways that felt normal to them. So, for instance, at Darden, this is how we've taken the essential 3 stages of the design thinking process of exploration, ideation, and experimentation, made it tactical, and turned it into a concrete set of steps that we can facilitate and work with managers often to learn that make it safe for them to think and act in new ways. So let's review them. We've talked a lot about our deep understanding of human needs and the way in which that's had this positive set of benefits that in turn impact the quality of the innovation outcomes. We could do the same thing for heterogeneous teams. There we talk about things like how we expand the repertoire of possible solutions when we bring a group of people together. We can talk about how we create alignment, how we broaden access to networks when we bring people with different networks together and have them solve it. In our research, we see very powerful stories that demonstrate all of those benefits, benefits which in the end lead to improved choices, enhanced likelihood of innovation and implementation, and increased likelihood of adaptability. We can say the same thing about dialogue-based conversations. We haven't talked much about the impact of design thinking on the experimental process. This is equally critical. We know that one of the challenges is, at a surface level, we all know that experimentation is a superior methodology to traditional analytics in an unpredictable environment. So we have to wean people away from their Excel spreadsheets and try and get them actually out in the field conducting these small, cheap experiments. The reality of it is, most managers have no clue how to design and execute an experiment. There's decades of research in cognition that say, for the most part, we have a set of flaws like hypothesis confirmation bias, that make us very bad testers. It's the kind of simple rules that design thinking bring that allow us to teach people this somewhat obvious but actually difficult skill set of how you design and manage experiments. This idea of a portfolio of solutions, again, in the paper we go into more details, but there's multiple ways in which that reduces the risks of investment. It helps us mitigate some of these cognitive biases. Perhaps most important, it allows for something that people who study complex social systems call emergence. In a complicated world, the best ideas will emerge in conversation. They won't be there at the beginning of the process. But think of how often in organizations, when we set out to innovate, we say, okay, here's the 4 alternatives, let's evaluate them. Well, the reality was, if those alternatives were attractive, we wouldn't have needed an innovation process. So this idea of how do we create a conversation where ideas are able to emerge during the conversation, that's where the power is. And then what we find in our research is not only do the ideas emerge, champions emerge who get excited about those ideas and carry them into implementation. And then finally, that 5th factor that we talked briefly about, the ways in which creating a structured and facilitated process makes it possible for managers to manage, for instance, the cognitive complexity of the design process. So where are we? To summarize, because I know you probably have a lot of great questions that we want to talk about. First of all, yes, there is a there there. First of all, the construct of design thinking clearly has validity. What people are calling design thinking does in fact have a set of key properties that across various methodologies are there and are working. Secondly, design thinking is impacting the process, but that's not necessarily easy to prove. Sure, as we said earlier, at a project level, it's easy to manage, to measure some of the hard, countable outcomes, but a lot of the most significant impact we see in our research is happening below the waterline. How do we measure changes in the conversation? How do we measure shifts in individuals' mindsets? That's really the next stage that we're getting ready to move to in our research, and that we hope you'll help us think about. Measuring these more challenging, but even more important aspects of design thinking. Third, we've learned that structure really does matter. And thinking carefully as leaders about how we introduce design thinking, giving people what is perhaps an artificially linear process to help them learn can be absolutely critical. We've also learned, and this is for the designers out there in the audience, that coaching really matters. Expert facilitation can make an enormous difference. What is really helpful, as we find, as we kind of try and, let me call it, democratize innovation across organizations, though, is that it's not the designers and coaches doing the work for people, it's doing it with them. So for instance, some of the most interesting comments in the study come from people charged with trying to scale design thinking in their organization. This comes from Intuit, where their leader said, what they learned as they attempted to scale was that not all design thinkers we chose were effective at getting others to do design thinking. There were some who wanted to be the brilliant person who comes down from the mountain with the solution, and they weren't actually very useful to helping us scale. The kind of designers that make a difference are the ones who want to partner with everybody else in the organization. Designers who want to give it away, not hoard it. Finally, I would say one of the key takeaways we take from our research is that in many ways today in business, we are obsessed with this idea of disruption and of novelty. Innovation is almost synonymous with big technology changes, with stuff that senior leaders, R&D teams, engineers, and scientists are concerned with. But what about everybody else in the organization? What we see in our research is that there are opportunities for everyone at every level in the organization to create better value for the people they serve, if we're committed to equipping them with the kind of methods and tools that let them do it. In this way, we have come to think of design thinking as a kind of social technology. Think of the dramatic improvements we've had in our computing technology. Those of us who at my age have witnessed a couple of decades of this, right? Tremendous. But in the end, innovation happens in conversation when people talk to each other. How many methods have we gotten to improve our conversation? I think a lot of people would argue that the methods we have gotten, like tweeting, have actually reduced our ability to work together collaboratively and find higher order solutions. Our research suggests, at least, that design thinking has the opportunity to do for innovation what total quality management did for quality. Think about it. At one time, we believed that quality belonged to a set of experts and had nothing to do with everybody else's job. Now, we know now that's ridiculous. If we want quality, everyone has to own it. Not that we don't have experts, but that on a day-to-day basis, the rest of us think about quality too, and we turn to those experts for particularly difficult challenges. We think it's the same with innovation. We're seeing a shift in innovation from this idea that innovation is something that certain people do to something that everybody in an organization has to do. And design thinking, because of its systematic structured toolkit, can put the tools in the hands of people, can make it scalable and teachable. So at Darden, we've spent a lot of time teaching it. I've spent a lot of my recent efforts working in the online space because we've now taught probably over 1,000 managers, either face-to-face or in our own SPOCs. We've taught 100,000 in Coursera MOOCs. And what we see is that people are able to acquire these skills online with the right design of their online learning and equipment. So for those of you who are more interested, these are just some of the kind of work that we're doing at Darden that I wanted to tell you about. What I'd like to end with is, first of all, an offer to share the full report with you just by downloading it from our Design at Darden website. And the final thing I'd like to do is invite you to be part of this research with us. We're just really beginning the conversation. I imagine if you've taken anything away from our discussion this morning, it's the complexity involved in demonstrating the ROI of design thinking. We've got a lot of work left to do. And so here at Darden, we are as part of an ongoing research project to really think about how we do a better job of measuring and documenting what we see as this incredible power of this new methodology. So with that, I will stop talking. Thank you for your attention and look forward to some of your questions. Back to you, Mariano.
Thank you very much, Jeanne. And you were probably not, well, you couldn't pay attention, but the chat was really intense, Q&A panel really intense, a lot of people raising their hands. So again, between Jim and I, we'll select a few. the first thing that people ask, will this be available? Yes, this will be available. We'll share the link. We'll share everything. Give us some time to package it up. Now, Jim, do you want to start? I have one that, again, as a CEO, I have a question, which is, sorry, Jim, I asked you to start, but I'm going to go start myself. It's like, how do I start? Because the iceberg idea is important. Some of those things seem to be results that happen in time, right? And a longitudinal analysis needs to happen. But the folks that are coming into organizations and need to show something to senior executives to give them more permission and funding, what's the first thing that they should try to do?
Well, my bias here is that design thinking really works best at a grassroots level when we issue the invitation to those who are interested to work with us on these projects. So, for instance, there's a project at the U.S. Health and Human Services Administration called the Ignite Accelerator, where they reach out and invite any of the 80,000 HHS employees around the country who have an idea to make things better for a citizen to come forward with that idea. They then have kind of a general kind of crowdsourced tournament. They pick a handful of people. They teach them design thinking. They give them mentoring. They give them support and all. And those people are off doing amazing things. One young woman who was a quality control officer at an Apache Indian reservation hospital in Arizona came up with an idea that is expected to save the hospital millions of dollars. Multiply that by 80,000. So part of this is beginning by making available these tools, which in part is why I think the online part is so critical, because it makes us able to do that cheaply and affordably. And then to help people think about measurement before they start a project. We know that a lot of the people who emerge as the early champions of design thinking are passionate. They're committed people. They're out there trying to improve a situation. They often don't want to take the time to measure. Right? They don't measure in advance. They don't think about getting pre-measures of the current situation so that after they've implemented the new solution, they can compare it to post-measures. Or they finish a project, and instead of going back and doing some testing to assess the different levels of success of different alternatives, instead, they want to run on to the next project because they want to make somebody else's life better, not validate what they've done. So I think this whole question of measurement is one that is really ripe for a partnership between people like myself and academics who live to measure, and people in organizations. Also between the people in organizations who measure outcomes, and the people who want to go make the world a better place. So I think this question of measurement starts with allowing people who are enthusiastic to have some early wins, so that you're not trying to justify design thinking as an abstract concept. I probably have more experience debating than most people, and I don't ever try and debate someone who has not experienced design thinking about why it's better, because they simply don't understand what you're talking about. We need early wins so we can tell them the stories so that they can have the experience of the power of design thinking. But at the same time, we need to think carefully about things like control groups, pre and post measures, all of the things that go into the design of a good experiment and measurement. So I think that's a great question, Mariano, and it's a question that we could probably spend another whole webinar talking about for an hour, but I think it's really important to bring some metric-oriented people into the conversation to help support the kind of design-oriented people who just want to do it.
Understood. And again, and your next study is going to be all about that. So folks that want to participate, remember to send her an email. Jim, now yes, your turn.
Yeah, lots of questions about the study, the evidence, the citations, and things like that. So please check the chat pane. We sent around a link. It's right there on the screen right now. We're going to put that into the chat as well too, so you can get it. And I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Jeanne, that most of the references and things are there in the study.
Absolutely.
And we're also getting a lot of questions kind of deep in the topic that Mariano brought up around some practical guidelines and how people actually can get started or implement some of the things. What are some of the top tactics that you would recommend? Is there something that you observed that you thought was particularly good at measuring or showing the ROI? And we realize some of these things are very fuzzy, but maybe there's an example or a particular tactic that you could talk about.
Well, I mean, I think this idea of measuring ROI at a big picture level from an academic viewpoint is kind of false, right? I mean, the return is a function of multiple impacts. So you almost have to tease out the particular impacts you're looking for. So for instance, if you're looking for customer-oriented impacts, then you have to think of things like Net Promoter Score, right? And you have to measure metrics using things like Net Promoter Score into the package. If we're looking at reduced cost or reduced wait time, those kind of metrics, those are, again, have a different set of metrics. If we're looking at engagement, there's a whole set of instruments to help you measure engagement, but in part, you almost have to have a hypothesis about where the ROI is so that you can have a metric on that with a before and after. When we start to talk about rigorous demonstration of ROI, it becomes more complicated and we have to begin to unpack effects. Now, the other thing I would say is storytelling is incredibly powerful. And in a lot of the organizations we work with, people become much less focused on a financial calculation of ROI when they become immersed in the story of what design thinking can accomplish in their organizations. For instance, we find the most hard-boiled executive confronted with needs that his or her customers have that aren't being met softens when they are confronted with that, right? So at the same time that, as a strategist and academic and a researcher, I'm all about how do we do rigorous, disciplined research in this area. I'd also say that one of the reasons why I think it's so compelling is because underneath it all, we're all human beings, and the human-centered aspects of design and the stories it produces grab people, and they want to do more of it. So what we see is, we often think of change ideally coming from the top and top down. That is, how do we facilitate design thinking from a top-down leadership perspective? Well, we have to do things like make it okay to make mistakes and fail, right? A basic principle of experimentation is you're going to get it wrong sometimes. In most organizations, getting it wrong is still defined as managerial incompetence. It's not defined as successful experimentation. So there are aspects of corporate culture, the focus on efficiency, right? We know that in a world of innovation, adaptability is a more important criteria in the long run than efficiency is today. In many ways, design thinking looks inefficient, right? So we have to begin to re-examine some of our corporate culture criteria. We also have to give people systems. I will tell you, most managers live to try and not make mistakes, right? But we've got lots of psychological research that tells us most of us have a preventative mindset, especially people who live in large organizations. We would rather, in the face of failure, not act than seize opportunity if in the process we could be proven wrong. The first thing we need to do is shift people from a bias for inaction to a bias for action. And that's where the structured toolkit of design thinking really becomes useful, right? But at the bottom up, there's also all kinds of things we're doing. We're just, we're seeing people logging on to our design thinking courses online, and they're just finding opportunities. One of the beautiful things about design thinking is it starts small. So when I talk to a teacher, I tell him or her they don't have to wait for the school superintendent to decide that they should use design thinking. They can learn these techniques themselves online, and they can go into the classroom and change those children's lives for the better the next day without senior leadership permission. So that's part of what's exciting about design thinking. It's kind of subversive. The whole idea of democratizing innovation and taking innovation out of the hands of a few and freeing the rest of us to make a difference. You know, I think in today's environment where many of us listen to a lot of discouraging news on a day-to-day basis, this idea that we can make a difference, that we can go into work tomorrow and do something without waiting for anyone else to tell us we're allowed to. I just think that that is something that is incredibly powerful and that we need in today's world.
Totally. And I always hear designers complain about design thinking and sticky notes on a wall and too many ideas. And I always tell them, guys, you need to make this happen because you need permission, you need to get funding, you need to start a movement. I mean, even though you can start small and do something, if you want to make an impact, you need to bring people on board. And probably your suggestion of starting small, doing a little case study of that, of the small impact there, but then bringing someone on board that's more senior that can be your spokesperson. I think that's a great tactic that again, I think it's a takeaway from here.
Yes.
Good question on the online. You mentioned that people can learn online pretty well. You suggested a few courses that you guys are presenting. Most of the, well, as I said, like there were a lot of companies or people in companies that were 100,000 or more employees. By definition, they're global, they're all over the place. How do you handle design thinking when it's project-based and most of the times it's people in person, at least the D-School started that way. And what's the bridge to making it work as something that we do every single day and no need to be in person?
Well, I mean, I think this is where Mural comes in, right, Mariano? This stuff is all, yeah, I was going to say, this is where the work you're doing in the virtual space is so important. This stuff is all easier to do face-to-face. There's no question about it. I mean, handling these complex conversations is easier when I'm looking at someone, right? And when they're in the room with me. And yet, for the most part, if we really want to tap into the diversity and richness of the opportunity here of bringing difference into the conversation, if we can only do it with people who are in the room with us, it's going to limit dramatically the number of projects that we can tackle. So I think the challenge is, how do we develop these virtual tools and the comfort so that we can solve these problems in a virtual room together rather than in a physical room together. And I think that's that really, to me, is one of the things at the forefront of design thinking. How do we make it possible for people to do this when they can't be face-to-face, and yet have those deep, rich conversations that we know are the hallmark of design thinking? So that's one where we are looking to technology to help us crack this one. I think it's the next big frontier in broadening the use of design thinking really across the world.
Yeah, and I'm gonna go to Jim on this one, but as I said, we're a part of this. We're documenting the visual conversation, but there's conversation happening. And you mentioned technology, but then you mentioned, confidence, and we talk about remote work confidence. It's important to have the design thinking and creative confidence that the guys from IDEO talk about. But after that, it's really hard to work remotely and feel and build rapport and take turns speaking and things like that. So there's behavioral change that needs to happen. And Jim and his team have been working a lot on that front. And we're actually putting together an ebook, right, Jim?
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to kind of deepen this a little bit and connect a few things together, perhaps. You talked about storytelling, which I love, and of course, I wrote a book called Mapping Experiences, which is about all the mapping techniques that you highlighted there in that one story, which I call, by the way, alignment diagrams, because I believe fundamentally what they do is they align perspectives within a team, but also the inside and the outside of an organization. So for me, the diagram is really a storytelling mechanism, and it's the conversation that you can have after that. which then, in my opinion, kind of shifts designers from, crafts people, creating an artifact to becoming facilitators. And you mentioned that facilitation is a really important part of this, particularly for this grassroots kind of design thinking movements that have to be created. How do designers need to think about it? How can I move from design as a craft to design as a facilitation motion?
I joke sometimes. Of course, I bring a lot of designers into my classroom. I'm working primarily with MBA students and business people for whom this is a different perspective. And there's no one more powerful than a designer with their feet in both worlds, who can bridge the gap between the perspective that a manager brings and the incredible richness and difference in perspective the designer brings. But sometimes I think I have to be very careful, because again, if we go back to the comment, some people want to hoard it and some people want to give it away. A designer who wants to hoard it will actually undermine the confidence of business people and make it harder for them to do the work of design thinking than it needs to be. So sometimes I challenge the designers I work with. Look, you believe in empathy, but I see lots of empathy for the customer here. I don't see any empathy for the manager that you're working with, right? So again, I think part of it is, let's use our tools on ourselves, right? How do we look at these people we're trying to lead along a journey as facilitator, and how do we understand the way they see the world? The way an average manager sees the world, especially in a large organization, is about 180 degrees from where a designer often sees the world, right? And so it is very hard for designers to understand the kind of fear and intimidation that what seems easy and natural to them, the effect that has on managers. So I think, again, we already know the answer. We're telling it to everyone else. It's how do we immerse ourselves in the perspective of the people we're trying to take a journey with, and better understand how we can make it possible for them to try out these new ways of thinking and behaving that are natural to us, but intimidating for them.
Jeanne, thank you very much. Designers out there, start the movement, keep pushing the movement. The other day I said, facilitators are the Jedi masters of our work, but we need everybody else to follow through, to support us, and again, basically talk the same design language, right? Mm-hmm. And again, I see a lot of people sharing frameworks, and they talk about the Luma guys. The Luma guys talk about the visual language, the design language that we all need to have to understand each other in our new modern business world, where thankfully we get as humans to be more and more creative, because the machines will take care of all the other more boring parts, right? Yes. So Jeanne, thank you very much for your time today. I think we overpassed expectations. We're going to be recording this. And this is not the end, right? You're going to be continuing doing your research, and we're going to be having better tools to measure the impact, better stories to tell, and we'll see you again soon, probably.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Keep doing the same thing.
Have a good day.
Cheers.